My name's Joseph Connellan. I've been working around disability and housing for about 30 years, mainly in the not-for-profit sector. For the last 10, I've been working for myself as a consultant. So I work to the providers of both disability and housing and also to government. And I do things like I sit on the Victorian Disability Advisory Council, and I'm part of advisory committees around the NDIS transition. And for the last 2 years, I've been focusing almost exclusively on housing around people with disabilities, particularly the NDIS transition. All of this would imply that I have a lot more answers than I do. So what I'm going to do is talk about as I understand the world today, which is full of questions and I suppose full of opportunities. So I'm going to give you my understanding of where things are. And I suppose the first thing we need to understand is this NDIS environment we're working in. I mean, somebody the other day described it as a washing machine, this period of transition and change. And it certainly has been nothing like, I've never experienced this level of change before in any area that I've worked in. They say it's the biggest social reform in 40 years, and I believe them. It's the biggest reform happening in the English-speaking world. We are tearing down and rebuilding an entire service system, and we're at the messy part of it as we're beginning to figure out how things work. And I think working in housing, I find that particularly frustrating. While it's an important issue, it is not the urgent issue. It is not the most important thing that's happening in the NDIS world at the minute. It will get to that, but we're not at that point yet. I think we are at a transition point in how the scheme is run. The agency itself, the NDIA, has got a new board and has undertaken price reviews and has appointed a new CEO only last week, the former CEO of Bankwest. We also in Victoria have a particular assertiveness in the state government that's not happening in other states. So there's quite different rollouts of the NDIS happening in Victoria than, say, New South Wales or indeed Western Australia. So it is a point of change. And I think it's worth considering how many plans we've got through. Of the 470,000 or something plans that need to be done, we have only completed 17% of those. And of that, there's been a very high level of criticism of the ones that have been presented. So those with useful plans might only be at 10%. We are at the beginning of the journey. Having said that, looking on to housing and thinking about where the Victorians who have a disability, who might get NDIS live, it's important to consider that they will live in different places. And those people with the highest levels of need, who are in the smallest numbers, will live in specialist supported accommodation, SDA. In some ways that's equivalent to our old group houses or shared support accom. But the majority of people, 94% of people who get support from the NDIS will get no significant assistance in housing. And I think that's a really important point. They will live in other parts of this, in other ways, in other tenures. So there'll be a portion that will live with who have high needs, who do not qualify for housing assistance. These are people that might have support levels of $100,000 a year or more and still not qualify for housing assistance. So I think we'll see the emergence of particular forms of housing models there. There's a bunch of people that live in public and community housing and social housing. I think increasing numbers will begin to move into the private rental market. And then there's a large number of people living at home who then may move out to or build their own housing. So I think when we talk about housing for people who are NDIS recipients, important we move beyond thinking about just that specialist SDA. That's an important part, but it is a small part of the equation. And like all these things, it's worth considering what exists today. So when you think about the equivalent to that specialist disability accommodation, it's the shared support accommodation is the technical term, but we tend to think of it as group houses. So we have a large number of people living in group houses, and when you look at that, what is significant about that, they are largely owned by the state government. 3/4 of the group houses are owned by the state government. They don't manage them all, they don't provide support into all of them. They provide support into about half of the total supply, but they are the owners of them. And this becomes very important because the state government is going through a process at the minute where it is considering outsourcing or moving or divesting of its support provision in those houses. And once the support goes, it then obviously raises the question about the future of those the ownership of the particular houses. Now, we don't know where that's going to end up or where that's going to go, but it indicates the sort of journey we're on. I think my key message here is that the state government is a very dominant player in this space and will be for another couple of years at least. So it's worthwhile watching them. In thinking about the new system, this new SDA, I want to just re-emphasise that it is for the top 6%, for those people with the highest levels of need. And there are some interesting aspects of it. The first one is that it is funded commercially and recurrently. So rather than a lump sum to an not-for-profit, it is a commercial payment that's been pushed out and made available to the private sector. This is radically different to anything that's existed in Victoria before. So it is a new way and brings new players into it. The rates are quite good. I was surprised that in some circumstances the individual funding for housing could be as much as $100,000 a year, not for support, just simply for the housing, which is a very large number from my perspective in thinking about housing. The NDIS is also pushing through some other changes. First one is the separation of housing and support, which we've done in small numbers in Victoria for 20 years but never at scale, and the other one is around choice of provider. These present quite significant challenges in how we develop and manage housing. So if you think about a group house, how we can manage to have multiple support providers operating in a group house and how that relationship works, it is quite complex, and we are yet to really unpack how that works. So once again, very important change, and we are at the beginning of it. If we think about the growth in Victoria, we know that nationally we have about 14,000 people living in what will be called specialist disability accommodation. We know that nationally it'll go to about 28,000. It will double. But because of Victoria's strong history in this space, our growth will be much less. We have about 6,500 people living in shared support accommodation at the minute, mainly in group houses, but other people living in the mental health stream, for example, live in much smaller properties. Now, if you think about that's the amount we have today, it's worth considering that about 100 of those houses or properties, more correctly, would be ineligible for SDA because they are too big. So the NDIS says, for example, you can't have more than 5 people in a group house. So we've got a number of 8-bedroom group houses, and so we need to consider how we deal with those. There is also a number of constraints about the number of people you can have on a single parcel of land, which means where we've had, say, 3 or 4 group houses built together, such as we have in the Kew Cottages redevelopment, they then fall into question about how they are funded or if they are held and continued in that space. So we have a number of ineligible properties. We also, with the introduction of the SDA, have essentially raised the access requirements. So the level of need in people going into specialist disability accommodation will be higher than we used to have going into shared support accommodation. And that means about 1,000 people who actually live in existing houses would not qualify in the future. That doesn't mean that they will be kicked out. They'll be funded and continue to be funded in that space. But it means that over time the level of need will increase, and those people who in the past might have thought that they would get in maybe won't get in. So once again, it's a challenging space. So I think that what we'll see is in Victoria the numbers of people housed raised to about 8,000. So we've probably got a growth of about 1,500 people, which is still a much bigger growth than I have seen in my working life. It is still remarkable. If I was doing this slide in Queensland, that figure would probably be double the existing supply. So it depends. In some ways, we are seeing the consequence of our good practice in the past. I think it's worth considering where those 1,500 people will come from. And I think this area is so complex, it's very important you break it down into sections and segments and deal with them individually. So in my mind, I think about those people who might be living in residential aged care, so YPINH, young people in nursing homes, and that typically is broken down into under 60s and over 60-year-olds, and that's to do with whether they are likely to move out or not. Old people older than 60 are less likely to move out than people younger than 60, for example. But if you look at those two categories, they probably equate to the number of spaces we have. There's probably about 1,500 of those. But we also have a bunch of people living at home with ageing carers who may qualify. There is people living in respite, so there's people moving around the respite system. And there's people who are coming out of child protection. So there's a number of sources of demand, if you like, into these 1,500. How they will play out, I'm not sure, and I'm not sure of these numbers. These are good guesses, really, in most cases. But what I'm saying is that there is a number of different groups that you would begin to think about where people would come to in the new, into this new housing. For me, in some ways, the most interesting part are those people that don't qualify for specialist disability accommodation, and that's 94% of people. So most people won't qualify. And I think one of the most important developments that's still emerging is the developments of the housing options package or exploring housing options packages. There was a presentation this morning and they were using a different abbreviation name for this. They were calling it EHOP, and I think it's the same package. I'm still not quite sure. But there is the NDIS is funding packages for people of up to 75 hours of investigation plus assessments, which allows people to very comprehensively go out and understand what individual housing options and barriers exist in their particular world. So this is immensely valuable. It's not well known, the planners don't all know about it, it is just emerging. But you know, this is something that I would be pursuing if I was looking to investigate this space. I think the other thing that's really interesting is that the NDIS only really consider the top 6%, and they don't talk about the practice in the bottom, the practice below that. So while we are likely to get more diversity, some of that diversity will be good and some will be bad. I mean, we're entering into a new era where choice will drive diversity. I think just to harp on that point about the 94%, as I said, they will get no substantial housing funding. They might, however, get the planning funding, which is very valuable. They might get home modifications and access to information. But I think what I want to do is begin to think about what happens in each of those segments. And by segments, I mean, I'm back to the pyramid. So we've talked a bit about the SDA, the top 6%. I've speculated around that cohort below that I think service providers will actually develop housing for people with high needs because it makes sense in terms of efficiency and effectiveness and getting better outcomes. I don't know, but I think that's what will happen. And then I'll talk a bit about social housing and the private rental market. So let's go into each of those. So in thinking about the high needs non-SDA, those in non-SDA, they have substantial amounts of funding, and we know that better housing delivers better outcomes. So I think something will evolve in this space. I don't know where or how, but I think something will evolve. And I think it will probably be driven around support agencies seeing the efficiencies. In terms of the traditional public and community housing, the social housing, we've just been through recent changes in Victoria where the access mechanism has changed and the eligibility has changed. The good news is that people who are NDIS recipients are in the priority grouping, so they have access to it. And the access is via the Victorian Disability Housing Register. Essentially, you'll need to go through your local homelessness agency or through DHHS, but it's a different system. The bad news is at the same time as people with disabilities are getting access to it in the priority system, the amount of housing available is going to reduce over the next 3 to 5 years as we begin the redevelopment of the public housing estates, and we need to accommodate people living in there. And other priority groups are also coming through. If you think about the work being done in family violence, that is also a priority group. So the priority access does not necessarily mean access. As I said, I think things will change in the private rental space, and we'll see the development of brokerage schemes and lead tenants models and head leasing programs. All of these things exist, but not particularly at scale. I think we'll begin to see them develop at scale. And then we'll also see, I think, work happening in private ownership, particularly around family-funded housing. I've been listening to lots of family groupings talking about this, and in the past the barrier has been inadequate support. That has now been changed, so we now have portable and adequate support. So families are now beginning to invest in their own housing developments. So I think in each of the different segments, different things are happening. Except in the SDA, I think there is not a particularly clear pathway, and even in the SDA, it is not a particularly clear pathway. So I think it is a hopeful area, it is a growing area, but it is confused. If you're unsure, well, that's okay, because I think everybody else is. The thing that makes this worthwhile is that we are generating more opportunities, and we'll have more people housed within 5 years, but it's just going to be in the washing machine of change for the next 2 or 3. Thank you.